Okay. Good. Welcome, everyone, to this meeting of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission's Legislative and Policy Committee. This is for Wednesday, May 25, 2022. My name is David Meyer. I chair the committee, and I want to welcome everyone. We are starting at 8:32 a.m. Our executive director has confirmed that we do have a quorum, so we will begin. Now, the first item is to look at the minutes summary of our meeting on February 17th. Does anyone have any corrections, additions, or deletions of that, of the summary? Seeing none, we don't need an action, but we will accept those for the record and move on. Since we last convened, the General Assembly has in fact completed its regular session, held a special session, and now you're slated to return next week to finalize the FY23 budget. And so the purpose of this meeting today is to talk about what, if any, action, specific initiatives that the Commission should take vis-a-vis the General Assembly relative to the ensuing year. So Amy has joined us remotely, and I'm going to ask her at this time to give us an update as to what has happened, or maybe not what has maybe perhaps not happened, and then we can have an open discussion about possible initiatives.
Sure, happy to do so. Thank you for having me here today. And I think I see Senator Eben in the room, if that's accurate. So I'm sure he can, yep, great. So I will let him also, he might have more of an update than I do. But what I do know is they're coming back next week on June 1st to vote on the budget. We will obviously see the budget 48 hours before they meet, because that is a requirement. I think folks are hoping that we may be able to see it at the end of this week before the long weekend. But if not, we'll get it by Monday. Obviously, the items that NBTC is still interested in is looking at the grocery tax and how that impacts transportation. If that language that we had worked on getting into the conference report is also in the budget, and we'll still have the conference reports as well. So there are still those conference report bills that are out there as well. So statutorily, if they're going to change the grocery tax, that bill is still alive, and hopefully our language will be in there, which is the language that says that we want them to look at replacing those funds over the next, and I think it starts in like 3 or 4 years. So the idea was to put it out, I think, past this current administration. So we'll be looking for that language. We'll also be making sure that there's no gas tax suspension or anything of that nature, which I don't expect to see in the budget. And then anything else that might have popped up, obviously in conference, some things could have popped up, but I don't foresee too many of them. But with that, I will let Senator Evans see if there's anything else I need to add to that, but that's what we'll be looking at before Wednesday.
Thank you. Just on the gas tax suspension proposal from Governor Youngkin, that was defeated in the Senate committee that I serve on, Finance and Appropriations. And in the House, I believe they referred it to the Appropriations Committee, which was a politer way to vote it down. I don't think that's still alive in the House at all, right? And
it's technically still alive because it's in the Appropriations Committee because it was referred there, but they have not met. So okay. I guess when they meet next week to take up the budget, that could technically be on the agenda, but I would be surprised if that came up.
Yeah, and the fact that it was defeated in the Senate, it means it's not going to happen. So
that's right.
We don't have to, I don't think, be too concerned about that. I don't have anything else to report. I'm looking forward to seeing what's in the budget myself.
Yep. So that's all we have. I mean, so, obviously, essentially just to kind of lay the stage, what we've got next year, looking ahead, as Mr. Meyer said, we will be looking at the 2023 session, ideas for anything that happens. Obviously, we will have elections in the fall of 2023. So that's after the after session, where quite a few things will probably change, since we'll have completely new Senate districts and completely new House districts. And there is still technically that lawsuit out there that is sort of asking the General Assembly House members to run again this fall in 2022 in their new districts. But there's some talk of that lawsuit being withdrawn, but that has not been decided yet. So that's still kind of technically out there. I mean, it seems to me that that's probably not likely to happen, but you never know. I mean, we've certainly done more surprising things, and if that happens, we'd have probably primaries in September and elections for the HOD in the fall. So that's kind of hanging out there, but I think it's a remote chance of that occurring. So, but just to know, so this will be the last session with the General Assembly make up the way it is currently in 2023.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. One of the recurring subjects that this committee has discussed in the past and is certainly front and center in everybody's mind is our support for Metro and the potential funding challenges that we will have to address in FY24 at some point. And I'm very pleased that Matt Letourneau has taken some time out of his schedule to actually be with us this morning, and would ask Matt if he could give us an update as to where we are today relative to not just the funding for Metro, but overall management changes and leadership changes and everything else.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. So in terms of the fiscal situation, it is improving some. The Metro board will be receiving an update in the next week or two. I have a little bit of a sneak preview, but I don't want to get ahead of the board. But we still will have a funding gap in FY24, as we've talked about. I think a combination of expenditure savings and we're running ahead of ridership projections despite all of our issues is putting us in a little bit better place than we were. But we'll have some detailed information out to all of our partners pretty soon on that, as the CFO is working on updates to those projections. In terms of overall changes, I think obviously we're in a period now where we have management change. We are in an interim period with Andy off. Andy was the capital delivery manager for Metro. He was overseeing Silver Line Phase 2, among other things, and he is now our interim general manager. And I think one of the most important things that has happened over the last 2 weeks at Metro is the empowerment of Andy and of Teresa Impastato, who is the chief safety officer, to take the steps that are necessary to ensure compliance with safety protocols. The problem has not been that we don't know what to do; it's the execution. And so, without getting into a lot of detail, obviously there have now been 2 individuals who aren't with the organization anymore. One retired, one resignation, and Andy and Teresa are really, I think, making great progress in terms of operator certifications. You saw that we only had the service reduction for about a week on green and yellow, which I think is a result of their quick and very focused work to get in place a certification program. The power desk discussion was very concerning, as something the board was aware of prior even to the MSC report, and something that steps are being taken to address. But I think big picture, we have a systematic funding problem at Metro. And I've said it before, but COVID accelerated it, but it would have been there anyway. And it would have taken a couple more years. But if you look over a 10-year horizon, expenditure increases are outpacing revenue growth, even under very optimistic ridership projections. And the gap over a 10-year period is as much as $1 billion. So we have got to tackle systematically the way that Metro is funded. And that is a big discussion, not an easy discussion. We know what it was like last time dealing with the immediate physical infrastructure issues and what it took to get dedicated funding. But that is going to have to be a regional conversation. I think the attitude of the incoming general manager, Randy Clark, who I am incredibly excited to have join us, and I think everybody in this room, once you have a chance to meet him, will understand why the board selected him unanimously to be our GM. And it was truly unanimous, not one of those back room, not unanimous, actually unanimous. Is because he really is brings a lot of energy, enthusiasm, and focus to this role. And what he has said already is, before we go and start having these conversations about funding structure, we've got to get our house in order. We understand we've got to get 7Ks back on the track. We have to get Silverline open. We have to be out of the headlines. We have to be operating safely and reliably and show that we can do it. And so I think he understands that. So in terms of the short term, it remains to be seen a little bit in terms of exactly what we're going to need for FY24, and what we can internally handle. There could very well still be pain when it comes to service. I mean, we're operating right now 100% capacity in terms of all of our operators and things like that, even with the fleet reductions. We very well may not be able to continue that level of service with this funding gap. But the bigger conversation, that's almost sort of a 1-year issue. It becomes a bigger issue after that, actually. So that's really the conversation that we need to have. And I'm not going to pretend to have, the easy answers. I think we're eager to have our new general manager in place to really begin that kind of deep dive on those issues. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's
No, it's very helpful.
where we are.
I do have I have a couple questions. First one is, putting aside the particular challenges facing Metro, as you just talked about, Silverline, safety culture, and the fact that we are covering 3 different independent jurisdictions in the country, how would you assess Metro's need for operating funding vis-a-vis the other maybe 8 major transit systems in the country: Boston, New York, Chicago, San Francisco?
Yeah, I think that all of them are in similar positions. I think, everyone has seen a significant decline in revenue. We were all fortunate to receive a large amount of federal money that has kept us afloat. The federal money had strings attached, and one of those strings was you couldn't reduce your workforce. So everybody's still operating at their pre-pandemic level workforce, absent whatever sort of natural attritions happen because of workforce issues. And so, most systems are providing more service than demand actually is dictating, even now with this recovery, particularly on rail in our case. Believe it or not, I know people are upset about headways, but if you just look at the passenger counts, we're still, not even at 50% of where we were. So everybody is kind of in that position of having that federal funding run out at some point in fiscal 24, different points for different agencies, and then not having the ridership revenue to make up for it. I don't think Metro is in a particularly unique place in that regard. What I can't speak to is long-term, how we compare. I'm not sure whether other systems are, our lack of a dedicated funding stream for operations is unique. We are the only transit agency in the country that doesn't have a dedicated funding source, a proceed from a particular tax or whatever it is. When you're reliant on annual appropriations, as you said, for operating budget from three states, or the city and 2 states, plus all of us local governments, that is very unique.
Okay. James?
Yeah, I mean, just one thought in terms, and this obviously doesn't solve the larger dedicated funding issue, but the PREA funding and the match from Virginia, Maryland, DC is more than a decade old now. I think it was 2010. Did it start?
Started coming out. It was 2009, but then it started coming out.
Right. Some of us are old enough to remember that. but it hasn't been adjusted for inflation, right? So that $50 million that Commonwealth of Virginia that contributes to match and $150 million, $150 million today is a lot less than $150 million was in 2009, 2010. So it seems to me that one of the things we need to start advocating for at both federal and state level is for that PREA funding and the match to, at a minimum, be adjusted upward for whether we want to call it inflation or increasing costs that Metro faces. Obviously, our challenge is much bigger than that, but we can't pretend that $150 million today is the equivalent of $150 million in 2010. It just isn't. So I think that needs to start being part of
Yeah, and that's
effort.
definitely true, but the PREA money is only capital.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah, so I mean, we have a much more acute
Yeah,
operating.
it doesn't solve that.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, the capital budget, we were sort of warning that we would run out of money on the State of Good Repair program. We thought somewhere in 27 and 28. That is now looking more like 32 or 33. So that is less of an acute issue in terms of covering the entire capital program. Now, obviously, we're having discussions about additional capital projects like the Roslyn Tunnel and things like that, which we're not talking about. We're just talking about the State of Good Repair program. But you're absolutely right. That hasn't been adjusted upward. And of course, we don't get any operating assistance from the federal government. That's, to me, the biggest thing. I mean, we move the federal workforce more than any other agency even comes close to, but we don't get any operating assistance and never have.
Oblivion.
Actually, I was going to refer to Senator Eben here. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Back in 2019, I think it was, we were getting close to maybe doing like a tour, getting some of the Richmond General Assembly folks up here to sort of experience what we have here. And maybe it's time to rethink that. So I'll pass it right. Okay, just pass it right back over.
Amy's got some thoughts on that, and I,
Yep.
Yes, and
at some point, Mr. Snyder.
exactly where I was going to go
Oh,
next.
well, there we go. We're all thinking alike, although I realize they might not see right now what they would have seen in 2019. So that may be a little, because ridership's down and it's, anyway.
Amy, do you want to talk to the conversations you have with Jason?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So, Kate and I were sort of prepared for this, and, Senator Eben had also brought it up. And now that although I know right now COVID is kind of peaking again, but I think the idea is kind of looking towards the fall, probably like a September kind of time frame to do something. I talked to Jason Powell, who is the Senate Finance Transportation staff member, and he was the one that we had the whole trip planned with before in 2019 when we had to kind of cancel it all. And so he is definitely down for it again. And so it's on his sort of like when the budget is done to-do list to kind of come back to and talk about. So, we were talking about maybe doing something jointly with the House to get folks up here. We don't want a huge group, but we want a manageable size group. So we can try to figure out how to do that, whether it's House Appropriations Transportation Sub and Senate Finance Transportation Sub, maybe also opening it up to the House and Transportation Committees, but we need to kind of figure that out. So we have a manageable number of people, but we want people to come from around the state to be able to see that. And we also probably have to do a little bit, I think, of thinking and planning about what we want them to see and how we can get them to experience that. So, but I think it would obviously be another situation of VRE, Metro, and some buses up here to kind of figure that out. And so, but I think September is probably what we're sort of shooting for, because again, it'll be past the summer. It's really hard to get people's schedules done in the summertime, but it's still sort of in the interim time. So that is that we are having those conversations and starting to think about planning for that.
So if that involves WMATA, I just definitely want to make sure we're integrated, particularly with schedules on 7Ks.
Okay.
So that we're showing frequency that we want to be showing.
Yep.
And then also,
that's another reason to kind of push it off is obviously too the new
that, and then also, I'm not announcing anything here, but we're the time frame that you're discussing is at least within the realm of possibility on Silverline.
Okay.
Probably not September, but something else just to think about. That's an event that's occurring. We hope in that.
And I would suggest that the arrival of our new GM be coordinated with this as well.
Sure.
so that we're really have a unified kind of a coordinated outreach to the GA and be really streetwise about targeting just the right people at the right time. I know that Randy's going to go to Annapolis, he's going to go to DC, he's going to go to Richmond, do the handshakes and all of and I don't mean to in any way to denigrate any of that, but that's, you don't get a second chance to make a good first impression. So I think we need to coordinate a tour to introduce this to the key people in the subcommittees, but also have the GM be part of it and have a kind of a seamless presentation so that we can just make the case in a very positive way.
So the only other thing on timing I'm thinking is then in November, there's going to be an election. Is that?
No, it would not this year. Hopefully not. I mean, unless that lawsuit goes through, but no, the hope would be that it would be the fall of 2023.
Okay. Because we don't want to like do a really bang
No,
up.
that's why we're thinking
Got
this
it.
year. Fall.
Got it. Sorry. All the elections and suits are kind of confusing me. So
I know
got it.
there's so many. We have a million.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Could I add a couple comments at this point? We've moved into a very specific sort of tactic discussion, which is very useful. I want to go back though to some of Matt's initial comments. This governance issue, which is constantly being played in the news media, has got to be resolved. And so I was pleased to hear those words. But I think anybody, whether it's his first visit or his second visit, is going to say, what specifically are you doing in the metro structure to prevent these recurrence of safety failures? So I'm hoping, number one, that he's far enough along, even before he makes his first visits, as to specifically what we're doing with metro governance. That would be point number one. Point number two, with regard to beginning to look at cuts, let me put on the table one more thing that I've said before. Number one, I don't see our jurisdiction coming up with much more than 3%. And I also think it unacceptable to totally close stations because then the value goes to practically zero for some jurisdictions, depending on which stations are closed. So you don't want that to happen. The third issue is I would like to see options. How are other systems funded, both in the US and internationally? I know some work has been done, but I want to see that very early on so that we can begin to direct our tactics to something that is A, effective, and B, potentially workable in the environment in which we're going. And finally, for NVTC, I think we need to update all of our studies about the economic value of metro and et cetera as a piece of this. But I'm really concerned about getting what are the key points moving forward that this body wants as a matter of strategy, and then putting our tactics like this visit in place in that larger strategy. So for me, it's number one, governance. Number two, what is the doomsday sort of cuts scenario that's likely without funding, that's reasonable? And I've laid out a couple of things in my view that make it unreasonable. And three, what are the options? Really, and cast the net pretty broadly at first before we narrow it in terms of how are other effective systems financed. Thanks. I just wanted to make those points early on in the conversation.
I had a quick question. Matt, I'm not recalling the gap that we're having. Is it all operational? Is it okay?
Yeah, and the gap that Metro has announced is 319 million, 24.
It's all on the operating.
It's all on the operating side. As I said, that's being looked at right now from the CFO level, and there may be a different number that's coming. That's probably a little bit better than that, but there still will be a gap. And to Dave's points, I think whatever is sort of put on the table, there'll probably be some scenarios that we're looking at to close the gap. And I don't think right out of the gate, we're going to have a set plan. It's going to be these things and that's all it's going to be. We're going to have to look at a couple of different options and scenarios, depending on exactly what that number is and depending on exactly what the savings is from it. It's hard to get a lot of savings, particularly with your work.
Savings.
It's hard to get a lot of savings unless, with the workforce that you have. So, you end up getting into headways and service issues, which is really the opposite of what you want to be doing because you want to get people back on and you want revenue. But, so that's going to be the challenge.
Well,
Hey, hold on. One other thing, just to Mr. Snyder's point, I want to sort of make a distinction, and it's just sort of semantics maybe, between governance and management. Because when I read a lot about governance, which I have over the last week or so, usually it's talking more about the board versus management, which is, the managers and what they're doing. And there are definitely people that want to talk about both of those things. I am obviously coming at it from a very unique point of view. I think the discussion about the board governance issue is really not particularly salient to this at this point. I think management is the issue. We've gone all over the place on governance and we've had lots of studies. I can tell you that our friends in Boston had a board sort of similar to Metro's, went to a unified system where the governor appoints all 5 members of the MBTA board. And now if you look at headlines coming from the north, they're arguably having a worse month than Metro is. They've got federal government coming in, they've got repeated safety violations, operator errors. There's only so much a board can do. I think for our part, the 8 people on the board right now are good people. They're there for the right reasons. The board is conducting itself very professionally. You didn't see any leaks about who the GM was going to be. You didn't see any of that play out in the newspaper. When there were personnel decisions that had to be made, they were made quickly. I think the board is being very assertive right now. And we're not waiting, to Dave's point, for the new GM. I mean, the interim general manager is making changes as right now to address some of the systematic issues that we've seen. But we needed as a board, I think, to send a message that the chief safety officer is empowered. Because when you look at sort of the chain of command, she's sort of outside of it, looking at the whole organization. And I think some of those directives were just not making their way into operations. And that's the issue that we know we need to fix. So, and we're not waiting for Randy to start to do that.
Let me just say, when I speak of governance, it's not the makeup of the board issue.
Yeah, no, I know what you meant. I'm just
internal governance, the control function, the whole internal management / governance. Yeah, thank you.
And I agree with you, but I'm just saying people are throwing those terms around and mean different things.
correct. Now, I would also make the observation, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on this, but the fact that Paul, in terms of being the chair, and Matt being heading up their financial oversight, both being from Virginia, I think is from our perspective at NVTC is a good thing. And as we go forward, once the federal money's run out and this proscription about keeping all, you can't let anybody go, we might have more elbow room. But on the other hand, if we go and we start asking the 3 jurisdictions, Maryland, DC, and Virginia, for funding, multi-year funding for operations, we could find ourselves getting in a shop vice where Maryland says, yeah, we'll put the money in there, but we want you to ensure that no positions are reduced. And then you have people in Virginia saying, we'll give you the money, but we want you to right size your organization. And so then you've got a situation that's untenable. So those are some difficult waters to navigate, and it's just the reality that we're facing here.
Can I ask a technical question of Matt, which is what percentage of the Metro's operating expenses come from revenue from fares?
So It's a completely different number now. I don't know, Kay, I want to say.
Used to come from it, or I'm
We'll-
just
we'll
trying to
get
figure
that.
out with it.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
we have one of the higher fare box.
But it's,
Right.
it's constantly changing. We can find out where they.
Yeah, I think we're probably in like I want to say 30s now.
We'll see. I mean, Greg's watching. but-
Yeah, and maybe,
Yeah, he might be able
you
to.
can tell me later,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
where we are now, but where we were before.
Yeah, over time, like a trend line.
Yeah, well, it's gone way down. Let's put it that way. And we just had a look last month at the cost per passenger. Oh, I mean, because if you're a passenger, it's
It's incredible.
big numbers.
And these systems, like Alexandria and the city of Fairfax, on our bus systems, we just said, we're not even going to collect fares anymore. That's a different situation completely from Metro Bus and Metro Rail. But I only mention that to say that all transit systems of all modalities are going to be very different 10 years from now, and in terms of where they get their money and how they operate. And so we have to sort of divine, what's best for this region, what's best for Northern Virginia. And it's, we're not going to get it exactly right, but we're going to do the best we can.
So just as to follow up on Mr. Snyder's question about the value of Metro to the Commonwealth, that is actually an action item for your meeting next week, which is for us to go out and get a contract procured to be able to do that work and update it. So we're actually already have that in the works. So
That's great.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I had a comment that's a little bit out of the box, so I don't want to, just before we move on. So Mr. Meyer and I just completed this tour in Germany with the Northern Virginia Regional Commission looking at energy. It was funded by the Heinrich Böll Foundation, which is a German foundation. They covered the cost. And I found myself, like I always do when I'm in Europe and we're moving around, thinking, this is incredible. Every American needs to experience this. I'm talking about the trains that go, between countries. I'm talking about the inner city going thing, the bikes, the scooters. It's amazing. And I think a lot of people in the General Assembly, not only are they don't know what what we're dealing with up here, they don't understand and they haven't experienced what goes on in Europe, which is actually kind of probably our goal. I'm wondering, out of the box, if possibly we should consider looking at maybe the Heinrich Böll Foundation or some group, their green energy, that's what they're kind of trying to promote, to have a tour of some legislators to some select places in Europe to get a real understanding of the transportation system and what's going on. And see Maastricht, where you got, the bikes are just, it's amazing. And that might possibly be worth it because I think that's a little bit our goal. And it's really hard, as I say, they haven't experienced even what's up here. If you've not seen it, you just kind of can't imagine it. And I'm just thinking that might be helpful and there might be some other foundations that would fund it so we didn't have to. So I just throw that out as an idea because we really need to expand people's.
Right. I was in a hotel. I don't want to devolve. We got to stay focused on this, but I was watching this ad on television in Frankfurt, and the French have this Citroen model of car. Well, they've come up with a new product that is like, it's basically a golf cart with a car frame around it, and it's been designated by the EU as not an automobile, so that 13 and 14-year-olds can drive it. It only goes up to 25 miles an hour. Usually it's more like 18. And these middle schoolers and high schoolers are using these vehicles to get from point A to point B. It's totally electric. And it's 6,900 euros with a 900 euro credit from the EU. And so it's catching on like wildfire in Europe. And this is the way people are going to get from point A to point B if they don't have access to transit systems. And when they market it on television, they say, I live in such and such a point. It's not viable for me to take a bus or a train. But so they're really mixing this thing up, and the internal combustion engine cars are really, they're 10 years ahead of us with respect to transitioning out of a reliance on automobiles.
And one more thing, I heard that the Chinese, it's for electric vehicles, they're working on switching out batteries. So instead of working about the electric pumping stations, like gas stations, it's more like the old horse and buggy thing. You just switch out the battery. And the Chinese are working on that, and that's something we need to be aware of so that we don't build all of these facilities to have, electricity handled like gasoline, when in fact, where the world is heading is perhaps switching out batteries. And we've just tossed a whole lot of things, and I will stop talking and we'll get back.
All right, but back to transit.
I have an answer
Well, it's
for
transit, but
Senator Evans. So in the FY23 budget, we have passenger revenue at 293 million, which is 13%. Non-passenger revenue is 81 million, which is 3.6%. The federal relief is 680 million, which is 30%. And our subsidy is 1.1 billion, which is 53%. So revenue is making up about 13% of our budget.
Okay, thank you.
For 23 adopted.
And
I'll
that's-
have to go back and
That's
look and see
rail
what it was.
and bus.
That's rail and bus, yes. But obviously, prior to the pandemic, we didn't have that $600 million of federal money. So that was pretty much the revenue that was being made up. So
And we actually, and I will forward to you, we had a slide deck from our WMATA committee the other week that actually did a nice little breakdown on revenue. So we'll make sure you get a copy of that,
Thank you.
okay?
Hence your opening comment that the trend line was going in that direction, was only accelerating.
it was accelerated considerably, but it was already going in that direction. Yeah.
Correct, okay.
I didn't fully appreciate how much it was going in that direction until this. Well, I became finance commissioner.
what are the advantages? And thank you, Matt, for all your work. Appreciate it.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
You guys do a lot and you don't get anything for it.
And Mr. Chair, if I could, part of the reason, and this is really early, normally we're not talking about sort of next legislative session, but obviously, we're working very closely. I think a number of you are on our WMATA committee. We're working very closely in sort of a lot of things that can go into our annual report that we're putting out this fall. But if there is, the question really for this group was, if there was something that had a particular legislative ask, let's start thinking early so we can work through it. The answer may not be, but we want to make sure that we're poised as we go into the fall with things really crystallizing, any data analysis that we can do, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Yeah, it seems to me that at the federal level, and Matt, it sounds like maybe you've spent some time thinking about this, but I assume there are other large transit systems in a similar FY24 situation. So, I spent about a decade banging my head against the wall on operating anything.
I know.
We can keep doing that, and it should be in there.
Yeah.
It ain't gonna happen, but it does seem like there is an argument to make for another round of relief for major transit
Mhm.
systems to
For sure.
bias and Boston and
New York,
MTA
Chicago.
and,
Yep.
we need
Cisco,
another
stuff
year or
there,
two to continue to recover. So it seems
Yep.
like in terms of the federal program, and I assume that's what AFTA will be arguing
Yep.
for.
Absolutely.
So I think that's our big ask.
And the challenge with it is, you're absolutely right. The challenge with it is, at least last time around, we had to put the sort of draconian cuts on the table in order to get attention from Congress. They weren't made up, they weren't fiction, they were real, but it took actually spelling it out for them to understand what would happen if we didn't get the money.
Yep.
So we may get to that point again.
Yep.
But
Yeah,
you know.
it sounds like that's probably what will have to be done, and
Yeah.
all of us will hate everything
Yes,
that we
yes,
see
you
there.
will not be happy with any of us on the Metro Board, yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
path. I mean, and then separate from that, I do think it's tough. Obviously, that's number one priority. I do think we have to start having the conversation at the federal and state level about adjusting PREA for reality. I mean, when we
That's a
started
good
it
point. Yeah.
in 2009, we were talking about buying rail cars. I don't know what a rail car cost in 2010. I'm sure it costs a lot more today,
Mhm.
and I think that just is very logical. Everything else in the budget has gone up. No reason that shouldn't too. So I think those are probably the two big things from my perspective that we need to emphasize.
Any other specific suggestions relative to between May and September in terms of what we might
So
want to do?
just in terms of the sort of perhaps short-term ask, if there is one. So I think we'll stay integrated with everybody and let you all know. Obviously, anything that would have to happen would need to be coming from all of our funding partners. I think, we'll do the work over the summer to understand better exactly what that deficit's going to look like and whether it's something we think we need outside help for 24. Let the new GM come in, which is going to be kind of towards mid late summer, and then work with the team here to.
Right.
And clearly, we will sooner than later look for an opportunity for the new GM to meet with the commission. I don't know if that'll be in September or October, but
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and just to echo, I know that something that Amy and I were talking about is, and maybe we're sort of somewhat looking to you, Mr. Letourneau, is having meaningful engagement with the General Assembly and the new GM early.
Yeah.
Really establishing that rapport, getting him down there as much as possible, because you know how the FaceTime really matters for Richmond. And so I think it's going to be.
Well, he has a lot of experience working in Texas with a bipartisan group of lawmakers from every side of the spectrum and with the congressional delegation. So that was something that the board was looking at in terms of, who we were looking for in a GM. And I think he definitely brings that. And he did the work here for APTA, so knows how Washington works too. So.
Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee, are we ready to go to that
Can I
yet?
just add one more thing
Yeah.
on number two? Just in terms of VRE, I mean, I assume it's, agenda is pretty much what it has been, to stay the course and continue to urge the Commonwealth to keep the commitments in terms of transforming rail in Virginia, and Governor Youngkin has absolutely certainly done that up to this point, but obviously we need to stress that.
And there are some bond issuances that are in the works.
Absolutely. It's something, again, you'll be seeing
All right.
next Thursday. Some emails came out on this yesterday.
We'll hear about that later this week.
And in fact, something I'm going to touch on in just a minute with TISDAC, it may, seeing how that goes through, I'll talk a little bit more about process. There may be something, I'm not trying to, that VRE may want to look at if things don't go their way on that conversation. So I've sent slides. I'm not going to go through all of the TISDAC slides. Part of the reason I wanted to share this with you is that just as a reminder, every 3 years, this is actually when the major dedicated funding legislation went through. There was also, in 2018, there was also reforms done to the way DRPT allocates transit funding across the state, pulling WMATA out so that they have their own set of funding, setting up the CROC funding, dedicated funding for VRE, and also setting up the dedicated funding for WMATA. But what they also did was do a reallocation in the way operating and capital funding for our other transit systems. And they use a long-standing advisory committee to vet those, and I'm on that. So we're meeting every month with DRPT for sort of an all-day Friday thing. And so there's no action right now, but I did want to give you a sense, because this is obviously something that affects the funding that goes to all of your local transit providers. But very important to know, this is not about your WMATA funding. That's a whole other conversation. And so what's happening right now is DRPT is proposing a couple of changes. And so far, there's nothing in, they're looking at changes, I should say, related to strategic plans that our transit agencies do, some of the tweaks to the formula or the competitive formula that capital gets. And then there's also a conversation about the formula for operating. And that's actually where I want to spend a little bit more time. So included in your materials here is a high-level overview of what's been presented thus far. Your transit systems, your staff are all engaged with us on this conversation. So I'm getting feedback from them. So just know that they're paying a lot of attention to this. In general, the changes to the strategic plan are very high. They seem to be very high level. They're a lot more about how frequent, how often, how complex. We obviously want to be able to provide some comments back, or the jurisdictions can, on that. When it comes to capital, the capital program, again, your systems are applying for things like for maintenance facilities or new buses or what have you. DRPT seems to be going in a way that they want to be able to reward those systems that are also applying for federal money. So there's a lot of conversations in that space in terms of DRPT maybe having reserve some funding that can be used to match federal awards if they're made. So there's some things within that space, and I think that there's the pros and cons to that, actually. But I think the area that we're just starting to learn, we're going to get, the next meeting is next week, but I've included some materials in here, is DRPT did set up the way they allocate transit funding for operations using a whole bunch of different metrics. And so what they did is they actually used the existing metrics and they ran the numbers again. And this is where it's quite striking. Let me see if I just pull up the actual slide. I think it's a very, very long, well, it's the last one. It's actually slide, well, it says slide 70 on the, but it's slide 16. It's almost the second to the last page. DRPT did a very initial run of running their metrics. And this may be a little bit tough to see, but what we found was most of the transit systems are hitting right at the same place in terms of funding, except for VRE. What's happening is the metrics that are being used by DRPT for VRE uses a factor that's passenger miles traveled. And so when you have long routes and less passengers, which is what we've had experience last year, they are severely impacted to the tune of a 60% loss in funding. VRE staff know this. We know that this is the very initial run of the aha moment of, maybe this isn't going to work. And so part of the reason I wanted to highlight to you is that we've asked DRPT to continue running different scenarios. We are going to see some more next week. We're going to continue, obviously, to work very closely with the jurisdictions and with VRE on what this looks like going forward. It may be that we'll come back in July and actually get formal comments from this body. Perhaps VRE will want to do formal comments as well on that. So I don't want to alarm you, but I wanted to let you know that we're watching this space very closely. There is some rewards for those systems that have a lot more ridership. For example, the Richmond and Fairfax connector have done very well. And so there actually would see more. So there's always winners and losers in all of this. But to see potentially a 60% cut in funding for one of our transit systems, I think would be something we want to pay attention to. And so I don't have answers necessarily, but we're asking a lot of questions of DRPT. And the reason why linking back to the legislation is also, is there, and this is just me sort of, VRE is very different from all the rest of the transit systems. Is there a reason that, is there an argument to be doing something like we did for WMATA, pulling things out? That's a VRE conversation. Just, I know, and Joe and I have been talking, I mean, yes, there is some replacement for VRE from the federal money, but not 60%. And so that's, would be a pretty meaningful cut. So this isn't going anywhere. This is just an initial run. But again, we'll work closely with all those systems on that. So that's really, I just wanted to highlight the stuff we're focusing on.
And I'll just say thank you, because what that tells me is I need to sit down with our own staff and have them help me.
Please
get my head
do.
around it.
Yeah, I mean, we work very closely with all of your jurisdictional staff on this stuff. And this is coming out like, it's like we basically, every month we're getting new data. The big action for CTB for any changes will be this fall. So that's why we want to be able to go into the summer, understanding what's going on. Public comment will be available. All of this stuff will be, if it goes into place, it still has a little bit of time before it becomes effective. But we definitely want to make sure we're mindful of impacts, especially to the level of like a 60% cut.
I can see that Loudon is impacted too.
Yes.
We have long runs.
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
So,
And we have had some initial conversations at VRE about this. Just wondering, obviously, it's more dramatic, because of the ridership challenges that we're experiencing on rail versus bus. But so this formula has been utilized historically.
For the past 3 years.
Okay. And presumably, though, that same, even when VRE was 19,000 trips a day, you still had this issue of its long runs compared to the Petersburg bus system. So were we disadvantaged over the previous 3 years?
So what I didn't pull in here is there is a special way to look at commuter rail already anticipated within the formula. So VRE already has its own sort of special model, and the intent was to hold harmless as close as possible. So historically, there was close to a hold harmless in the way the data they were using for VRE versus everybody else. So not to put you on the spot, remind me again, there's a specific commuter rail element to the DRPT formula.
Yeah, it has to do with the sizing, which sort of then gives you the pot.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly what you brought up. Discussing what the TISDAC models would look like. You know, we did poorly if all we do is ridership. We spend a lot of money because we take people 35 to 60 miles. So when you compare that to a bus system that takes them 2 miles, their costs. So they changed our sizing formula to take the length of the trip into consideration, not just the number of riders. So we have a sort of separate amount where they set this aside and say how much should VRE get, because they later on sort of compared pot we're allowed to go after. So different.
And one of the other conversations that we had at the table was, at what point so for several years, DRPT was using sort of the 19 or the 18 data, because there was just so much fluctuation, and since a lot of this is related to ridership. And so this is now looking at the newer data. We've had some systems, as you can see, who've actually really rebounded and done well with ridership. So there's a lot of question about, at what point do you stop grandfathering and start moving forward, and there's winners and losers in the way you do that. So as I said, there's lots of folks sort of rolling up their sleeves on this. So we'll be coming back, I'm sure of it, but I just wanted to kind of alert you.
I think one thing that will be important to stress in this conversation, and I assume this is consistent nationally, is that it's just going to take commuter rail longer to come back. It's going to be a different kind of recovery. We're already seeing that with bus, but even commuter rail relative to Metro or New York subway, there's just a different ridership profile that they're serving than we are on commuter rail, and it's just you're not comparing apples to apples when you're looking at one fiscal year. It's just going to take longer. Absolutely.
But DRPT has been very cooperative. I think one of the things, and I know that so the Secretary Miller spoke at VRE. There is still a sustained commitment from this administration for VRE and its investments. So I think we can leverage that in that conversation. So.
I think on VRE, there's one other issue, which is commuter rail in general, which is if people aren't commuting as much, what's the change in business model? In other words, how can those assets and systems be used to address changes? For example, more reach out to people during the weekends for pleasure travel. Do you see what I mean? Is VRE and are the commuter rail systems looking at how they're going to have to change their business model because people just aren't commuting to work the way they once did?
Yeah, Dave, that's what we honestly spend 90% of our time at VRE talking about, and we could definitely get you a briefing or presentation. I'm sure Joe could arrange for that, but that's the direction that we're going, and transforming rail in Virginia is so important. So we're going to have Saturday service, we're going to have evening service. We have a new marketing campaign to try to reach out to new riders. So we're pulling on all those levers, but you're exactly right. That's what we have to do, because the old model isn't going to get us back to 19,000 trips a day. So we got to figure out a different way to do it.
Thank you.
All right. Kate, did you want to say anything? Well, committee members, anything more on this? I know we're running a little behind here. You want to speak at all about federal update at all?
There's not too much real quick. We've had, I think if you recall from our last meeting, a number of raise and FTA related discretionary grants that our jurisdictions are putting forward. This is really good, really promising. I think, whether it be getting more electric buses or there's a number of different trails to connections to WMATA and things like that are moving forward. And also, I think if you recall, I'd mentioned at our last commission meeting, we have a great deal of interest for an earmark from both Connolly and Bayer to do a $2 million earmark for planning to keep moving the Route 7 BRT forward. And that was really positive. And I think every single one of your jurisdictions provided, on the corridor, provided letters of support, and that is just fantastic. And so we obviously are going to continue to engage with those offices over the coming months. We do have a lot more things in Route 7 happening, so there's going to be some more public engagement as well, which will also help. So that's really what I have in the federal space. So.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Mr. Schneider? Oh, okay, all right. Well, if not, we are adjourned. Thank you. Appreciate everybody coming.
Thank you all. Thanks for great work.
Thanks to whoever brought the donuts.
So actually, I want you all to meet kind of who